Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jacqueline and today's thrilling case is about heartbreak, betrayal, and sabotage. This case is not only physically unbelievable, but also an emotional roller coaster. It had me captivated from beginning to end, and if you have not heard of this case, then I hope you will be as intrigued as I was. This case is a solved case about the life of skydiving instructor Victoria Cilliers. This is a longer case, so we're going to jump right in. Pun intended. When Victoria Cilliers opened her eyes on April 5th, 2015, Easter Sunday, the first thing she smelled was dirt. When she felt around beside her body, she realized she was lying on her back in a field, and she could feel soil and soft ground underneath her. She wiggled her toes and fingers, utterly relieved that they worked. She couldn't believe she was still alive. Then a familiar voice called to her. It was her friend Kate, a trained doctor, who knelt down beside her. As more and more people started to crowd around her, she could hear the blaring of an ambulance in the distance getting closer and closer. Victoria Cilliers had just survived a 3,000-foot fall skydiving from a plane, falling at 60 miles per hour, after both her main parachute and reserve parachute failed to deploy properly. Approximately 14 seconds in free fall. It was a miracle that Victoria had survived, and it would later be determined that part of her survival was due to the fact that the field she had landed in was recently plowed and offered her some cushion to break her fall. Victoria was an experienced jumper and a qualified free fall instructor. She had previously completed 2,654 jumps without issue, and it was a passion of hers since she first jumped as a teenager in high school for charity. Victoria would not realize the extent of her injuries until she reached Southampton's major trauma unit after being airlifted there from the field she landed in. Believing that her injuries were only minor, as she could still wiggle her toes and fingers and felt no pain up to this point, she would soon find out just how bad her fall actually was. Victoria had a shattered pelvis, broken most of the ribs in her right side, damaged her bladder, had a collapsed lung, and several spinal fractures. After blacking out several times, Victoria would later wake in the hospital to see her husband Emile by her side. What would unfold to be the true story of what happened to Victoria the 5th of April would shock not only Victoria herself, but also the world, as investigators began to discover that this was no accident. Victoria was born in 1975 in Edinburgh, Scotland. Her mum was Scottish and her dad was from Devon, England. The two met at a students' union where her mum was studying to be a nurse and her dad was studying to be an actuary. After Victoria was born, her mom quit nursing to be a stay-at-home mom, and a short time later her little brother Christopher was born. They were a happy and close family who sat down to eat dinner together each night. As she got a little older, Victoria would spend her free time riding horses, and she became so in love with the equine world that she decided she wanted to become a physiotherapist to treat and care for injured horses. Everything seemed to be going well for Victoria and her family until, at the age of 14, her mother was diagnosed with bowel cancer. Her mother died when Victoria was only 16 years old, and Victoria was devastated. To cope, Victoria would turn to music. And after taking up drumming in school, she would spend countless hours drumming to tapes of heavy metal bands and trying to drown out her despair over her mother's death. One day, when Victoria was in high school, she saw a poster for a charity parachute jump on the way to drum practice, and she knew it was the adrenaline rush she needed to help release her feelings of anger and depression over her mother's death. So she signed up, and shortly later, she would be jumping out of an airplane with a few of her other bravest classmates. After that first jump, Victoria was hooked. She became an adrenaline junkie, and 4 years later, she would become the physiotherapist she had always dreamed of being and join the army in search of the constant rush. It was also here where she would discover that the military provided adventure training courses, and one of them was parachuting. She immediately remembered the jump she did for charity back in high school and how much she enjoyed it, so she signed up for the course right away. It was only a 2-week course to start, however. Victoria loved it so much, she signed up for the accelerated freefall program right after, eventually leading to her certification as a free fall instructor. Before Victoria met her longtime husband Emil, Victoria had been previously married to a man named Liam, who was also a fellow jumper and troop commander living in the same mess as Victoria. Seeing as he was also a jumper, Liam understood the passion for the sky and didn't fault Victoria for spending a lot of her free time at the parachute center. They even jumped together as much as possible. They had gotten married a year after they met in a small, intimate ceremony in 2004 at a church in Haddington, Scotland. Shortly after the wedding, while the two were enjoying married bliss, Liam decided to switch professions and become an ammunitions technical officer. This meant that he would have to attend an 18-month training program in Kineton and would only be able to come home for the weekends. Victoria was upset but wanted to be supportive, so she wished him the best and they did a long-distance marriage. But things started to become more difficult than they had imagined. With Victoria still having to do jumps on the weekends Liam would come home, they started to grow apart. And about halfway through the marriage, Liam's attitude started to change. Before, the couple would talk for hours on the phone at night and throughout the day, but slowly Liam started to become unavailable, not finding the time he once had for Victoria. Soon Liam would start to make excuses as to why he couldn't come home on the weekends, and they were becoming more and more frequent. Even when Liam did come home, Victoria noticed that he was distant and very protective of his phone. Whenever he would get a text, he would cover his phone quickly and try to prevent Victoria from seeing it. This left Victoria feeling very suspicious, but it wasn't until she noticed a woman's name, Lucy, pop up on his phone several times that she began to actually suspect something was going on. She even noticed some of the messages being sent, thinking of the pancakes we made together, and I miss looking at the stars with you. Victoria thought the texts were far too intimate to be receiving from another woman, but decided to move on and not make a big deal out of them. She knew that Liam was under a lot of stress during his training in bomb disposal, and without context, she didn't want to jump to conclusions. And she was glad she didn't, because after a few months of this rough patch, things between the newlyweds started to pick up again. Liam was coming to the end of his training, and Victoria was relieved that things could start to get back to normal. They could be a happily married couple once more, but things would not work out as Victoria had hoped. Sometime down the road, when their relationship did seem to be improving, Victoria returned home from work one afternoon to the landline ringing. When Victoria answered, the person on the other end quickly hung up. Thinking it was a wrong number, Victoria went about the rest of her day. But the same thing happened again several more times. The phone would ring, Victoria would answer it, and then immediately the person on the other end would hang up. Eventually, on the fifth call, a voice on the other end answered. Hi, sorry to disturb you. I just wanted to phone you to tell you what an amazing husband you have. Victoria was caught completely off guard and noticed the female voice on the other end had a Canadian accent. Okay, said Victoria. I'm on a course with him, the woman continued. I think you're really lucky to have him. He really loves you, and I just thought it would be nice for you to know that. Victoria was shocked and didn't know what to think about this phone call. What is your name? Victoria asked. Lucy, the voice on the other line said. Victoria then confronted Lucy and asked flat out if she was having an affair with her husband. Lucy denied it at first, but would eventually admit that, yes, they had been seeing each other for just under a year. Victoria was completely heartbroken. She immediately called Liam and told him he needed to come home right away. Liam confessed, but told Victoria that he had ended it and ultimately chose Victoria. Victoria called Lucy back from the washroom and basically bitched her out. She learned that Liam and Lucy had met when Lucy had relocated from Canada to attend the same course in bomb disposal training as Liam, where they hooked up after a party one night. Victoria loved her husband and decided to stay in the marriage, trying to see if she could make things work. But this would not be the last time that Liam was unfaithful. Victoria would catch Liam acting suspicious again, messaging a woman named Emma shortly after the affair with Lucy, and this would prove to be the last straw for Victoria. After Victoria's marriage with Liam ended like a burning trash fire, it would not be too long until she met a new man, Emil Cilliers. Victoria met Emil in the winter of 2009 in her treatment room while she was still working as a physiotherapist for the Army. He had hurt his knee really badly on a skiing trip. Emil was part of the Royal Artillery working as a PTI, physical training instructor, and although this was their first time speaking, she had seen him around the regiment's gym a few times. As the two continued their sessions, they developed a friendship. Victoria even said, quote, "Initially, there wasn't much of an attraction. We just became genuinely good friends. But over time, Emil grew on me, and after a few months, there was an evident spark between us." Emil eventually asked Victoria out on a date through Facebook Messenger, and she immediately transferred his medical care over to a colleague so they could go out. For their first date, Emil would take them rock climbing, and Victoria was instantly attracted to the fact that he was as outgoing as she was. The two became very close, very fast, even telling each other that they loved each other after only a few weeks. After the heartbreak that Victoria experienced with Liam, she was enjoying the attention and romance from this new and exciting relationship, but she allowed herself to get swept away in the feelings of love and adornment all too quickly. In fact, Victoria had no idea that Emil was actually married to a woman named Carly during all this romance, whom he had 2 children with. Born in Cape Town, South Africa, Emil was described as a thrill-seeking and active young boy. Wanting a job that kept him energetic and fit, he joined the British Army in 2004 as a physical training instructor. Now, Emil did tell Victoria about his kids and wife, but he told her that they were married on paper but were separated and that he no longer loved her. Emil told Victoria that he only came to England for work experience and had planned to return to South Africa when he was finished. But then he met Carly, and she got pregnant only 4 months into their relationship. He told Victoria he felt obligated to stay with Carly, to be the good boyfriend and help raise the child, so he married her. He said it all got too deep too fast. Soon after their first baby was born, Carly wanted another child, and Emil said he didn't want his daughter to grow up without a brother or sister, so he agreed. He still didn't love Carly, but wanted what was best for his daughter. He told Victoria he was never serious about Carly and that it was only for the kids that he stayed with her. Now, here's the real story of what happened. In South Africa, when Emil was 16, he met, fell in love, and dated a girl named Nicolene Shepherd. Nicolene was only 13 at the time, and they were high school sweethearts. 3 years later, when Nicolene was 16 years old, she gave birth to their first child together. The two would continue to date, but over the following year, Nicolene would discover that Emil cheated on her multiple times. Nicolene said even with all the unfaithfulness, she still loved him, and she continued to take him back each time, that she was under the spells of his charm. Emil would eventually ask Nicolene to marry him with his grandmother's ring, and she said yes. This is when Emil went to the UK temporarily on the working visa and met Carly Taylor. He cheated on Nicolene with Carly and decided that he wanted to be with her instead. But rather than be a man and tell Nicolene the truth himself, he had his mother break the news to her over coffee, and she was devastated and completely shocked. They had 2 children together, and she thought they had a pretty happy relationship. So Emil ended things with Nicolene and started dating Carly, eventually marrying her. After a few years went by, Nicolene decided that she was going to move to the UK as well for unrelated reasons. Also, the kids were at an age where they wanted to meet their dad, and she allowed. When they met up again, Emil told Nicolene that he and Carly were divorced and it had not worked out. Not long after that, Emil and Nicolene decided to rekindle their love, and they got back together again as one big happy family. But here is the real story about that. Emil was, in fact, still married to Carly, and one day when Emil was with Nicolene and the kids, he left his phone unattended, and Carly called. Nicolene answered it asking who was calling. "It's the wife," Carly replied. Needless to say, both women were shocked when they found out what Emil had been up to. They confronted Emil, and none of them would maintain a relationship moving forward. Carly and Emile would remain married but become separated. Now back to Emile and Victoria. So, not quite the story that Victoria heard. Emile chose to leave a few pertinent details out of that version. Emile wanted Victoria to meet his 2 kids with Carly, but knew he needed Carly's permission. Carly agreed, but said that she wanted to meet Victoria in person beforehand, and Victoria was totally on board. So they went for coffee, just the 2 of them. I am personally so surprised that Emile was okay with this. Given his history with Carly, did he not think the 2 women would talk about him? I don't know. But things went well, the 2 seemed to get along just fine, and Carly agreed to kid visitations. As Victoria was leaving the coffee shop, however, that's when Carly informed Victoria about Nicolene and Emile's other 2 kids. Surprise, surprise. Naturally, Victoria was shocked and angry. How could Emile not have told her he had 2 more kids? When she brought it up with Emile, he said he was ashamed and wanted to tell her but didn't know how. So Victoria let it go, and the 2 would continue their whirlwind relationship for the next year. In 2011, Emile invited Victoria to meet his parents in South Africa, where he ended up proposing to her during their visit to a cheetah sanctuary for rescued and injured cheetahs. He had the ring hidden in one of the cheetah's collars, so when the trainer brought the cheetah over for Victoria to pet, she saw it and said yes. A few months before they were to be married, Victoria found out she was pregnant, but unfortunately, she miscarried. Victoria and Emile were shattered, but not long after that, just before their wedding, Victoria became pregnant again. Expectant and glowing, Victoria walked down the aisle, and the 2 wed in loving bliss, ready to start their family. Victoria would give birth to a little girl named April. But their happiness was short-lived, as the couple would soon find themselves in financial trouble after April was born. Victoria, who mostly handled the money and was the main income source for the 2, was finding small amounts of money withdrawn every now and again from the couple's joint account. Chalking it up to new baby finances, Victoria never mentioned it to Emile and went on with her life. Things did not get better, though, and there were even more random and unexplained withdrawals being made from the account as time went on. This time, Victoria would mention it to Emile, not even being accusatory, just curious. But each time she did, he would get extremely defensive and mad that Victoria was untrusting of him. But the money kept disappearing, and soon it became evident that it could be no one other than Emile that was spending it, and spending it faster than it could be replenished. But Emile would always have an explanation for everything. Excuses like, "Your account must have been hacked," or "There was a mix-up at work and I wasn't paid on time, so I needed some for groceries." Or if she found a sketchy receipt in his pants, he would say, "It's not mine," trying to persuade her it ended up in his pocket by accident and actually belonged to someone else. Victoria was becoming more and more suspicious of Emile's spending, and his odd behavior was not going unnoticed to those who knew the couple. Soon things even started to get a little creepy. One afternoon, Victoria got a call from their 16-year-old babysitter's mother with very disturbing information. "This is really awkward, but I think your husband's been asking inappropriate questions and sending lots of messages to my daughter." Victoria was then sent screenshots of text messages Emile had sent to their babysitter, asking and saying things like, "Do you have a boyfriend?" and "You look really nice this evening." When she confronted Emile, he actually said, "My phone must have been cloned." I mean, come on. When she asked how that was even possible, he said that his Apple account must have been hacked and proceeded to deflect the blame onto her, saying she was in the wrong for not trusting him. Desperate to believe the man she loved, Victoria moved on, especially out of the interest of their new baby, but still sketchy behavior continued. She noticed Emile was receiving emails from a sex club, but he insisted that they were because he only went there a long time ago with his ex-wife and never got around to unsubscribing to them. The most damning evidence came shortly after that, when she saw messages on his phone he received from a woman saying, "I had a great time tonight," to which he replied, Yeah, me too. It's just as well there was that security camera in the car park. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. Even with this evidence, he still denied any wrongdoing, and the excuses kept coming. Don't put your own issues onto me. Just because your ex-husband cheated on you doesn't mean you can be paranoid with me. Despite all of this skeevy behavior and tension between the couple, Emile convinced Victoria to actually have a second baby, and she soon became pregnant again. But money wasn't just vanishing from their joint account. Victoria was noticing money withdrawals from her personal account too. And of course, when she approached Emile, he had another excuse loaded. "I think your card has been cloned or stolen," he told her again. It's really weird how he always says things are being cloned. He loves that excuse that things are being cloned. Anyway. And don't forget that during this time, Victoria was paying the majority of the bills because Emile was still a broke student. In fact, there are so many instances of Emile cheating on Victoria and taking her money that we would be here for hours if I went into all of them, which is really unfortunate. I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that Emile was less than a good husband and Victoria was becoming more and more depressed. She now felt trapped in the marriage with the new baby on the way, and Emile was becoming more and more distant. He was taking more trips and weekends away, taking and using more of her money and showing little interest in her second pregnancy, and Victoria knew in her heart that he was having an affair. Very pregnant and very depressed, Victoria was looking forward to New Year's at least, because it would be a time that her and her husband could spend together thinking about their new baby and how to rekindle their relationship. So when Emile told her that he was leaving town for New Year's to go to Germany for work, Victoria was angry and disheartened. She was immediately suspicious because she knew from having spent years in the military that reserves did not work over the Christmas and New Year's holidays. Sadly, she also knew there was no point in trying to persuade him to stay, so she dropped it. Victoria would state in her book, I Survived, that spending New Year's alone, pregnant, and with a toddler was one of the lowest, saddest, loneliest times of her life, especially knowing that Emile was out partying and probably having a blast with other women. It was devastating for her. He didn't even message or call her on New Year's Eve, but sent her an emotionless text the next day saying, Happy New Year. When Emile returned home, there was a noticeable change in him, and during an emotional conversation initiated by Victoria about the state of their marriage, Emile admitted that he wasn't sure that he wanted to be married to her anymore. He said this to her while she was still heavily pregnant with the child he wanted her to have. After Victoria gave birth to their son Ben, Emile left her alone once again to go stay at the army barracks so he could have time for himself. She was left to take care of the kids alone again. The next morning, Victoria woke up, went to the kitchen to put on the kettle and make April's lunchbox, but she smelled something odd. She smelled gas coming from their gas range stove, and it was filling the air. She immediately turned the lever off that was attached to the pipe, only to notice some dried blood on it. She instantly texted Emile about it, pretty frantic, to which he replied, Is the stove working? Not wanting to find out and potentially blow the house up, Victoria refused to try. So Emile told her to open all the windows and leave it for a while. She did, and the smell went away, but when she went to turn the pipe back on, the smell of gas hit her again in the face, and off it went once more. Victoria called a gas man who said it was just a loose bolt. He fixed it up and said everything was fine. She was free to go about her daily activities. When Victoria jokingly asked Emile if he sabotaged the pipeline trying to kill her, he just snapped back, why? And got extremely defensive. Emile would return home and things would continue to be awful around the house. Emile would have aggressive outbursts and lie about using their money to buy sketchy things, cheating on her, and he would leave for weeks on end with little notice. It got so bad that Victoria would start waking up in the middle of the night and go walk alone in the streets of their neighborhood just to have some peace from Emile and not feel his overwhelming contempt towards her. But it all changed when one day, out of the blue, Emile perked up and suggested that he and Victoria go on a jump together. that it had been too long, and they could use the quality time together. It was his gift to Victoria for the birth of their new son, Ben. Now on to the timeline of what actually happened on that fateful day. After Emile proposed that the two go skydiving together as a gift for the birth of their son, Ben, Victoria was elated. She was so happy that after so long her husband wanted to spend time with her, and she thought there could be a chance to save the marriage. So Emile called the parachute center and set it up. However, he then dropped a bombshell on Victoria. He told her that he didn't think they would be able to find a sitter in time and that she should jump without him. She was again devastated, but was determined to make this a bonding experience for the two of them. So she insisted that he come along to watch and bring the kids. Victoria was initially hesitant because it had been so long since her last jump, since before her pregnancy with Ben even, and she had wanted her first jump to be alongside Emile. She eventually let him persuade her, as he reiterated it was his gift to her for having the baby, and she loved skydiving, and she could use the time for herself. When they got to the parachute center, Victoria took a hard look around and realized that overall, skydiving was taking away a lot of time from her family, time that could be spent trying to repair their marriage and raise their children. Because it had been so long since the last time that Victoria had jumped, before Ben was born, the automatic activation device on her main parachute was out of date, and therefore she would not be able to use her usual kit. So her and Emile went to the kit store on site at the parachute center, and Emile signed out a temporary parachute for Victoria to use that day. As they were leaving the store, April said she needed to go to the washroom, and Emile offered to take her. Realizing that Emile had accidentally taken the parachute kit with him, she waited a few minutes for them to return before heading to get ready for her jump. However, the weather would take a turn for the worse that day, and the jump was actually delayed until the following afternoon. When Victoria went to hand the parachute kit back to the rental store, Emile stopped her and suggested that she just keep it in her locker overnight, and that no one would say anything because she was an instructor after all. Victoria agreed, and the two would return home for the evening. The next morning, Victoria returned to the parachute center to complete her jump without Emile because, of course, Ben was acting up and Emile offered to stay and watch him so that she could still enjoy her dive. Although Victoria agreed, she was still hesitant and had a nervousness that she couldn't shake about the jump, but she buried her fears so as not to let Emile down. She retrieved the kit from her locker and proceeded to the plane with a few of the other jumpers for the day. When Victoria jumped from the plane, her face was hit with a rush of cold air, and once free in the sky, calmness swept over her. She was remembering the love she had for jumping. She stretched her arms out in the cool air, and for a short time, she felt the freedom of the open sky around her. She enjoyed the moment and let her mind be at peace. She then reached for the parachute toggle and pulled, ready to deploy her chute. But as the canopy released, she was hit by a strong and sudden jolt, rather than the expected slowing sensation of a deployed parachute. As she looked up, she could see the lines of the parachute were badly tangled. Remembering her training, she calmed her panic and immediately started maneuvering herself in the air through a series of kicking motions against the wind to realign her parachute straps. Victoria would later recount that in all the years she had jumped, she had never seen a tangle quite like that one, and she started to realize that she would not be able to salvage her main parachute. So quickly cutting away at the main parachute straps, she mentally prepared herself for the intense jolt that the quick-acting reserve parachute would have on her. Because reserve parachutes are meant to be used in emergency situations, they are designed to open very quickly and with a snapping motion that makes your body jerk upwards heavily. But when Victoria released her backup chute, to her horror, she felt nothing. Looking up, she could see that only part of the reserve parachute had opened, and it was flapping around uselessly in the wind. Now panicked, Victoria turned to her training once more, kicking against the wind to try and get the parachute to catch the resistance, but again it was no use. Nothing worked. She began to spin quickly and ferociously as the ground beneath her got closer and closer. As she fell, struggling to get her parachute to catch the wind, she thought of her children. She thought of how she needed to live to see them again. Scared and confused, she was dumbfounded as to why her parachute was not working, and even with all her experience and years of jumping, she could not fix it. As she contorted and spun violently in the air, her only thoughts were why and how. Then, after hearing a sudden and abrupt loud bang, she blacked out. After arriving at the hospital, Victoria still was not aware to the extent of her injuries, and she could still not feel any pain. When she found out they were giving her ketamine, she was shocked. Doctors also placed her in a pelvic binder to keep her pelvis from moving. It looks something like a medical corset, if you can picture that. It wraps around your hip area and fastens with belts to tighten the straps and keep everything from shifting. During a routine exam shortly after, though, as soon as the doctor loosened her binder, Victoria screamed in agony as pain shot through her pelvis. Even through the ketamine, the pain was unbearable. She couldn't believe the pain that she had just felt. It was undescribable, and Victoria was starting to realize the destruction that had been done to her body. All the while Victoria was lying in her hospital bed, Emile was right by her side. Unfortunately, he was staring at his phone and being totally indifferent the entire time. Victoria was destroyed emotionally and physically. She was thinking how they had been getting along just before the jump, but now he didn't seem to care at all about what she was going through. In fact, he even came across inconvenienced. It only took a few hours after the incident for people involved to become suspicious. The parachute center took a very close look at the parachute Victoria wore that day due to the extremely low probability that both parachutes would malfunction. Initial examinations determined that it was not an accident, and the word sabotage could be heard in the air. The following day, after the examination, the parachute center called the local police with their findings and suspicions. The police would then send Victoria's parachute away to the British Parachute Association for further inspection, where it only took 4 weeks for the BPA to determine that the parachute had no mechanical or manufacturer issues, and therefore had to have either been tampered with by a parachutist themselves or a third party. For skydivers, every time someone jumps, it is protocol that their parachute be thoroughly checked. Every detail must be inspected. The person who double-checked Victoria's chute was her husband, Emile. It would be determined that some of the slinks were missing from the parachute Victoria used that day. And slinks are essentially cables that are looped through the end of the harness straps, then connected to the lines of the canopy of the parachute, and then again within themselves, creating a strong and sturdy loop. It wasn't long before Emile would be charged with the attempted murder of Victoria and was taken into custody. When he was asked about having an affair, Emile spilled everything. He held nothing back. He spilled intimate details about his behavior leading up to the incident, but when asked about his wife and her parachute, he denied everything. But police were certain and went to Victoria with their suspicions and findings. Even after everything that she had been through, Victoria still had a hard time believing that the man she once loved and married would try to kill her. She knew he was a liar, a cheat, and horrible with money, but a murderer? The trial wouldn't officially begin until 2.5 years after the incident, and throughout this time, Victoria was never allowed to confront or speak with Emile. The trial began in October 2017, and details about the incident and Victoria's life were all over the news. Also released was the fact that Emile had been having a long-term affair with a woman named Stephanie Galler. Victoria would find this out for the first time while reading the news during the trial. The two had met on Tinder around 2014 when Emile had gone on a skiing trip. In fact, at the time Emile was questioned by police in the interrogation room shortly after the jump, Emile told police that Stephanie had broken up with him. He told an incredible sob story to the interrogators of his damaged heart while he wrapped a police blanket tight and warm around him, all the while looking down at the floor like he was the victim. During the trial, Victoria would be forced to read many, many of the thousands of text messages that Emil had written to Stephanie. Text messages that read, "I will sacrifice and give up so much for you. I just never want to let you go." And "From April onwards, I can do random and spontaneous. To be with you, I would do anything." Keep in mind that Victoria's accident happened in April of that year. So why would he feel like he would be free around that specific time? Was he planning something? If so, how long had he been planning this? Victoria would even read that while she was recovering from her fall in the hospital, Emil was writing to Stephanie from beside her hospital bed. Vicky was in tears last night, saying all she could think of is she didn't say goodbye to the kids. She's undergoing surgery right now. One day, we might have a family of our own. And if that wasn't bad enough, Emil would also be two-timing Stephanie with none other than his ex-wife, Carly. In a text message to Carly, he wrote, "So tonight, we fuck twice." Okay, calm down, Emil. And he had sent this when Victoria was heavily pregnant with Ben, the child he wanted them to have. It was even revealed that Emil was texting Stephanie while Victoria was giving birth to Ben in the next room, in the delivery room. Financially, over the years, Victoria had loaned Emil over £18,000, and he never paid her a penny of it back. Emil would also be the beneficiary of £120,000 worth of life insurance if Victoria had died. He was also revealed to have about £22,000 worth of his own debts. Now that doesn't seem like that much to me, but then again, he was also still milking Victoria for all that she was worth. And he still had that much debt. He would use the money for lavish outings with his mistresses and to fund his trips around the globe, while Victoria stayed at home with the kids. At one point during the trial, the prosecution played a video for the jury wherein a parachuting instructor goes into a toilet cubicle, similar to the one that Emil took April to the washroom in on the day of April 4th, 2015. Now, if you remember to before, Emil had also taken the rented parachute with him into the washroom, the same parachute that Emil convinced her to keep in her locker overnight after her jump was delayed due to bad weather. The parachute sabotage done by the instructor in the video took just over 5 minutes. Now, this was particularly damning evidence considering that when Victoria was questioned by police after finding out Emil had, in fact, been cheating on her, she had stated that he had been in the washroom with April for about 5 minutes. But when Victoria was on the stand that day, she recounted her statement, saying that she was exaggerating the time because she was angry and wanted revenge on him, so she made it sound worse than it was. Victoria would state in her book that she wasn't trying to downplay the possibility that Emil had sabotaged her parachute, but that she may have been mistaken about the time he spent in the washroom, and she didn't want to taint the jury with false information. The jury would deliberate for 8 days and not be able to agree on a verdict, so the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. During the retrial, Emil was put on the stand and asked if he would ever hurt his wife, to which he replied that he never would. But the evidence was too much. The gas leak was determined to be his first attempt to murder his kids and wife, and then the parachute incident. Emil was eventually found guilty on 2 counts of convicted murder and sentenced to 18 years in prison. However, even after the trial, Victoria could not get peace. She would decide to visit him in prison to hear from his own mouth, but he denied everything and said he still loved her. As of July 2020, Emil refused to sign divorce papers, and they are apparently still married to this day. Although I did read that Victoria is seeing a new man, but is taking things very, very slowly. Emil and his family want to appeal. So, that is the case of the sabotaged parachute. I would love to hear your comments and thoughts below. Do you think the gas leak was a first attempt to murder his family, or was it a coincidence? What are your thoughts on the fact that Victoria stayed with her husband for so long even after she knew of his sketchy behavior. When I was researching this case, I was amazed at how much Victoria was willing to put up with. She wanted so desperately to believe the best in her husbands, and both ended up cheating on her, and Emil started to use all their money, and she really just wanted to live that dream life. And unfortunately, I think that she turned a blind eye a few too many times. And the signs were there, I think. But on the other hand, till death do you part, she made vows to these men. So I can really feel for her tough decisions, how she must have been caught between a rock and a hard place. I don't know what I would have done in this situation. I can't say I would have for sure done anything different. There were many times where I'm sure she really truly tried to believe that what Emil was telling her was true, that she probably should side with her husband on many of the issues. I don't know. It's really difficult. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and help out a girl starting a new channel. If you enjoyed hearing about the case, then subscribe. And I've got more true crime deep dives of solved and unsolved cases on the way. As always, thank you so much for watching. My name is Jacqueline, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye.